every day. Hospitals, EMS services, and lay people across the globe use Zoll products to save lives.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present. I feel like most of my talk's been done now, so we could just all have an early lunch, but somewhat of a spiral curriculum, I think. We're going to revisit some of the concepts. As introduced, I'm mostly based at Curtin University in Perth, but I'm also the director of the Australian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. So I'm very happy to talk to anyone about what the work we're doing there too. I do receive some partial salary support from St John Ambulance Western Australia, and where paramedics do use qCPR devices to measure CPR quality. And I'm also the co-chair of the ILCOR Education Implementation and Teams Task Force. So I spend part of my life in sunny Perth and the other part in not so sunny Melbourne. Sorry, Peter. But as one of my colleagues who lives in Adelaide, which is right in the middle of Australia, pointed out, Perth, all weather, no culture. Melbourne, all culture, no weather. Both very interesting places to visit for different reasons. So, I think by now we've heard plenty about what the actual 2015 guidelines say. Press hard, not too hard. Press fast, but not too fast, and don't stop. So very much the Goldilocks principle here. So I thought I'd just throw this slide in because there's a website, it used to be called Boring EM, that was actually its title, but one of my colleagues who was actually on the EIT task force, Blair Bingham, has done some summaries of these little Gen Y picture type summaries, identifying the top changes in resuscitation, and it's got summaries for ALS, BLS, PEDS, etc. So interesting way of presenting changes very effectively and very quickly. So I'm going to talk a little more about bringing this together, and particularly leading up to asking the question about whether CPR feedback devices whether they work or not. So clearly in this discussion we have some assumptions that CPR quality is currently less than optimum, that CPR quality is associated with patient survival, that CPR feedback will improve CPR quality, and that CPR feedback will improve patient survival. So I guess I'm predominantly setting this more in the trained responder, so in the paramedic and in-hospital setting. Do we have evidence for this? We do have some evidence that stemmed from over a decade ago, or started over a decade ago, from Gavin Perkins did some work that showed there's suboptimal CPR performance, and in particular this is showing suboptimal compression depth during ALS resuscitation training. So if you've got even if we're aiming for between 4 and 5 centimetres, which was the old guidelines, Gavin showed that the performance was way below target. So we've got problems in training. But what about in the real world? Well, Lars Wick and colleagues were the first to show that in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, performance by paramedics was less than ideal as well. And in fact, over a third of chest compressions were too shallow. What about in-hospital? Well, Ben Abella and colleagues looked at the actual chest compression rate across the x-axis here, and the number of 30-second segments of CPR, and showed considerable variability, as you can see, in the actual chest compression rate. And if we think we're sort of aiming for around here, you can see that quite a few compressions fell outside the actual required range. So not so good in hospital either. Well, you've got to ask the question then, well, if we haven't got good CPR performance, is it associated with patient survival outcomes? And why would we be interested in this? Well, we've seen that chest compression depth is associated with achieving satisfactory cardiac output. So here's showing that as you press harder, the cardiac output increases. So it's pretty straightforward that we do need to press at a reasonable depth, 5 to 6 centimetres. We've shown that compression depth, or it has been shown that compression depth, this was in hospital, is related to shock success, so the likelihood of reversal of VF after defibrillation. So this showed that as the compression depth goes up, that the shock success increases. So clearly we're starting to build an evidence base that's indicative that pressing hard, pressing fast is actually better. What about actual patient outcomes? Because clearly reversal of defibrillation is really important, but we want to know how does it impact on patient outcomes. So there's an out-of-hospital paper, this one, that looks at compression depth going up here and percentage of patients admitted alive, or in other words, pre-hospital ROSC. So increased ROSC with increasing compression depth. Another in-hospital paper showed similarly that compression rate was related to ROSC. So increasing rate along here and comparing at that same rate, did you get more ROSC versus non-ROSC? And the answer was yes. And moreover, in the ROSC group, you can see here that the mean compression rate was higher than the mean compression rate in the no ROSC group. Chest compression fraction has also been shown to increase survival percentage with increasing chest compression fraction. So overall, what does the evidence actually show? Well, one of my PhD students, Milena, looked at doing a systematic review or updating one that had been done previously on looking at what's the relationship between chest compression or CPR quality and patient survival. So what she found were, first of all, in relation to compression depth, and you can see here that there was 5 studies listed here. What their actual results were is displayed pictorially here, and then a meta-analysis produces an overall effect that's weighted by the actual outcomes or the effect sizes of the actual individual papers. So this was for ROSC and this was for survival to hospital discharge, and you can see that the little diamonds actually fall to the right of the nil effect result. So what's found with the meta-analyses is that compression depth is associated with ROSC and compression depth is associated with improved survival to hospital discharge. So survival to hospital discharge received deeper compressions than non-survivors. What about compression rate? Well, some additional studies here. You can see that the diamond now is showing that a slightly lower rate is actually associated with better outcome. But a lot of this has been influenced by some of this large study here that came out of the ROC group, and that was referred to previously. But so what this actually showed was influenced very much by the IDRIS study, the ROC study, that showed there's lower odds of survival for compression rates that fall outside the range of 100 to 119. So once again, that influenced the statement, our ILCOR co-star, suggesting that the range should be between 100 and 120. However, the research, as is so much the case for a lot of these resuscitation research, is fraught with heterogeneity. For a start, there's lots of different definitions of ROSC, despite our attempt to standardise this with our Upstein criteria. There's still different durations of ROSC, time frames, etc. And the actual time period of measurement of CPR quality varies considerably. And in fact, Milena's just had a paper accepted in resuscitation that pointed out that there's no real standardisation of how people are reporting these CPR quality studies. And there's different inclusion criteria as well. Some people only include VFRS, which makes comparison against papers that included all comers somewhat difficult. That's despite the fact that a number of years ago, there being guidelines that were actually put out about uniform reporting of measured quality of CPR resuscitation. this paper recommended the collection of data over the entire resuscitation period if you're going to do research in this field, but as Milner showed, that there's very few studies that do that. So the ultimate question then, we still had this body of evidence that suggests better CPR leads to better patient outcomes. So then this led to the idea that if we have a device or a mechanism for measuring CPR quality in real time and providing real-time feedback to the paramedic or the nurse or the doctor or whoever's doing the CPR, if we can improve that CPR performance, well, maybe we can improve patient outcomes. Koons showed a number of different devices are on the market, and also went through how this works. So we go from the pressure to a display of the output onto a screen, and many of the devices will actually enable some feedback to the rescuer about whether they're pressing too hard, too shallowly, too slowly, leaning on the chest, etc. So it's audio-visual feedback. And here's an indication of the visual feedback. So if your compressions were not going past the line, well, then the machine would tell you to press harder. There was a preliminary study that showed that CPR quality was improved using real-time feedback. In this study, that the mean chest compression rate again fell within the recommended range, and also the no flow fraction improved. So we had some evidence that using audio-visual feedback devices improve the actual process variables or the performance of CPR. Quality of out-of-hospital, and as well as in-hospital, out-of-hospital as well. This showed again that compression rate improved, it slowed down and became more within the guidelines, compression depth increased, and the percentage of too shallow, too deep was also improved. So it was looking very promising. And Gavin Perkins and Joyce Jung produced this systematic review that actually made the statement that there's good evidence supporting the use of CPR feedback prompt devices during CPR training, improved CPR skill. However, they did identify that there still wasn't any hard and fast outcomes in relation to whether it improved patient outcomes. So what we really want to know is whether CPR feedback devices will improve these patient outcomes. So when we heard that this trial was being conducted, the HOSLA study, with a number of our North American colleagues, we're all very excited because this was a cluster randomised design study, recruited about 1,500 patients out of hospital, allocated them to either the use of CPR feedback device, a qCPR, versus no feedback device. And the outcomes of interest, well, the primary outcome in this study was actually ROSC, but we wanted to see whether it impacted on survival outcomes. So not as we might have predicted, the CPR process improved, so we saw consistent compression rates and compression depth and fewer compressions with incomplete release. So the performance of CPR fell more closely to the recommended guidelines, so that's a good first start. However, unfortunately, we didn't see any impact on patient survival outcomes. So that was all a bit disappointing, no doubt, not the least of which was to the manufacturers, but those of us that really expected this to be a solution to poor real-life performance of CPR were a little bit surprised that we didn't actually see any difference in ROSC, survival to hospital discharge, any of the survival variables. So that is actually a little bit of a disappointment. And similarly, when we looked at a systematic review of looking at audio-visual feedback devices by healthcare professionals during CPR, the overall, with all the studies, showed that CPR performance increased. However, patient outcomes showed no significant difference. So, conclusion for the evidence. was that we haven't been able to establish that the use of CPR feedback devices improved patient outcomes. Now, why was that the case? Why was that the case in the HOSLA study? Well, you've got to look, when you're examining the reports of these studies, first of all, what was the baseline performance of CPR like? And when you think that half of the cases in this study came from King County in Seattle, where they have the best CPR outcomes of anywhere in the world, you can see that perhaps, or you can make the suggestion that perhaps the capacity to improve outcomes really wasn't there in the first place. So this hasn't been well tested within an environment that has less well-performed CPR in the first place. So that's one issue. Maybe the feedback isn't, we haven't perfected the actual feedback that needs to be performed. Perhaps there was overall the Hawthorne effect of the paramedics in this case knew that they were being measured, so they all went out of their way to perform perfect CPR. There was also a cluster randomised design trial, which I'm never quite as convinced about cluster randomised trials as individual patient randomisation. Sorry, Gavin. And there could have been a training effect. So what that means is that paramedics were allocated to use the CPR feedback, then they had a period of time, they swapped over, didn't use it, swapped over, did use it. So, you know, it's not unreasonable that there could have been a carryover effect there. Even though the authors did statistically test for that, it still may not have been, there may have been some results. So we really, I believe, still do need a good RCT that looks at the effect of CPR feedback devices on patient outcomes. I don't believe that the question has been 100% answered yet. It's not surprising then that in the European Resuscitation Council, as with other guidelines, that it does recommend, as you've heard before, that CPR feedback or prompt devices during CPR should only be considered as part of a broader system of care. But I still think that that's really important to interpret that as if you don't measure something, you can't improve it. And what CPR feedback devices do provide you is the data to be able to download to a computer after the event to actually analyse what is going on. Are we having lots of hands-off time during intubation, for example? And this is actually what Milana's PhD is all about. And she's downloaded the qCPR data from a number of patients' arrests in Perth, Western Australia. And hopefully that's going to highlight some potential issues that we can then look at improving. So this system of care is extremely important. And if we do look at King County, which does have the best outcomes in the world, that's reinforced by saying it takes a system to save a cardiac arrest victim's life. And so we need to look at all links in our chain of survival. CPR is an important one, but it's not the only one. And we can't expect to just put out a device into our services and suddenly we don't have to worry about all the other links, right from the emergency call up until post-resuscitation care. So thank you for your attention and please feel free to contact me.